This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. From the launch your online shop stage, all the way to the we just hit 1 million orders stage. No matter what stage you're in, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/special offer.
I'm Jason Palmer, one of the hosts of The Intelligence, The Economist's daily current affairs podcast. The Economist's award-winning shows make sense of what matters, from our special series on China's president to our weekly podcasts on business, technology, and American politics. Our journalists provide fair, in-depth reporting on the events shaping the world. To get the annual plan for less than $2.50 per month, search for Economist Podcasts Plus to start listening today.
Max, is it fair to say that 2024 has not been kind to journalism so far?
I think that is extremely fair to say, if not an understatement.
Max Tani reports on the media over at Semafor. And yeah, this is going to be a show with two journalists talking about journalism. But seriously, the last few weeks have been rough. How many journalists do you personally know who have gotten laid off in the last 6 months?
It's probably too numerous to count. I probably know more because I cover media and news for a living.
It feels a little bit like Survivor out here.
Exactly.
Allow me to just run the numbers here. The Los Angeles Times laid off 20% of its staff. Time Magazine, 15%. The music site, Pitchfork, has for all intents and purposes vaporized. So is Sports Illustrated. I could go on. The details of these layoffs are pretty horrific. One journalist said they got canned while on a work trip to a remote lighthouse in Oregon. They had to text the boss and ask, is my company card still going to cover my flight home? Reporters at The Messenger learned their jobs were kaput after the New York Times reported it. Some of them had been wondering what was up after they saw a little extra money in their bank accounts. It turns out they were being reimbursed for their vacation days before payroll shut down. To be frank, journalism has been in trouble for a while. But one of the more surprising things about what's happening now is how deep the cuts are going. Nearly half of the LA Times Washington bureau got let go. And there's about to be a presidential election. It felt to me like journalism was kind of hanging on until this year, a presidential election year, because it was like, if we can just get there, we'll just get the juice of the election. Do you think that's a fair way to put it?
I think that's totally fair. And I think that actually mirrors the way that a lot of people in our business, in our industry, thought things were going to play out.
Has the juice of the election year materialized?
It really hasn't.
Today on the show, more and more journalists are finding themselves out of a job. Why an election year is not going to save them, no matter how existential the threat. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This show is brought to you by Discover. You know, in today's world, it can seem that the best treatment is reserved for only a few. Well, Discover wants to change that by making everyone feel special. That's why with your Discover card, you have access to 24/7 live customer service, as well as $0 fraud liability, which means you're never held responsible for unauthorized purchases. Finally, no matter who you are or where you are in life, you'll feel special with Discover. Learn more at discover.com/creditcard. Limitations apply. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Most of you listening right now are probably multitasking. You are listening while you're driving, cleaning, exercising, maybe even grocery shopping. But if you're not in some kind of moving vehicle, there's something else you could be doing right now. Getting an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's really easy, and you can save money by doing it right now from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save nearly $750 on average. And auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles on your policy, being a homeowner, and more. So just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year. So you're protected, no matter what. Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations. The first thing Max Tani wanted to emphasize when we started talking about how this election year is connected to journalism layoffs is how important elections have historically been for reporters. Every 4 years, there's a cycle, reliable as the seasons. A bunch of politicians run for president, and newsrooms staff up to cover them. Simple. The problem is that Donald Trump messed with this cycle. When he first ran for president, this seemed like it could be a good thing. Talking or writing about Trump attracted viewers and readers. It was good for journalism, or at least the bottom line. Eventually, this phenomenon even got a name, the Trump bump.
It went insane. It went completely nuts. 2016, I was basically a breaking politics reporter at Business Insider, one of my first full-time jobs covering politics. And I remember when Trump got into the race and I wrote a few stories about comments that he made. And you just remember what the web traffic looked like on these stories. Just straight writing through some of the comments that he would make at rallies would get you hundreds of thousands of views, and this is on Business Insider. This was not on the New York Times or ABC or NBC or some of these big outlets that already have this built-in traffic. This was in, a digital news startup that was kind of just scrapping.
I imagine as a young journalist, you kind of felt like, not like I'm a god, but like, wow, I really did something because that traffic was so coveted.
Absolutely. It was really important for the business. And I think that it was exciting for people in our industry that there's essentially this guaranteed that anything that Trump was going to say was of huge interest to a lot of people who may have been passive news consumers, not the kind of core engaged audience who reads everything about politics.
And it became this cycle, right? Like, it's like people realized, like, oh, this is getting attention, started covering more of it. And then it got wrapped into how news sites and newspapers advertised what they were doing. Like, you need to come to us because we have the content you want.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think also the nature of the coverage changed as well over the course of the 2016 primary. I think at first it was covered as something of of an amusement and a bizarre spectacle. The guy from The Apprentice is running for president.
That's what we don't know. How much of it is Trump tapping into the legitimate anger and frustration in the Republican Party? How much of it is celebrity and reality television? What we do know is this, he used the word schlong there against Hillary Clinton. He says that's a common term in politics. No, it is not. And,
the Huffington Post put Trump in its entertainment section.
Controversially.
Yes, controversially at the time, but it was a huge boon for the industry. Les Moonves, who was running CBS at the time, famously said, Trump may not be good for the country, but he's damn good for CBS. And that was the attitude that I think a lot of people in the news business had, whether they wanted to admit it or not, that he was a rising tide that was lifting all boats and was helping these news networks post pretty massive ratings and was helping to boost kind of these nascent digital subscriptions programs for news organizations and bringing in lots and lots and lots and lots of traffic to digital media only outlets.
Did someone coin the phrase Trump bump for what was happening?
I don't really know I'm not sure. I can't remember who coined it, but it was certainly something that everybody immediately in the business understood, just because stories about Trump were more interesting to the public than most normal political stories. And
the bump was durable. Like when Trump was president, the bump continued because, I mean, the way that a producer on this show once put it was like every day the story is like, Godzilla's on this building. What is Godzilla doing? What is this building? Like, it's like because everything seemed so urgent, it didn't become, it wasn't just the election. It was the presidency itself.
Yeah. Obviously, the stakes were different when Trump became president versus when he was a candidate on the ballot. And so when he would say things or do things, they were inherently newsworthy, even in a way that they weren't when he was a presidential candidate. There were a lot of debates inside newsrooms about how to cover Trump and when to take his comments live and when to not take his comments live.
Tonight's dueling town halls sparked fresh criticism about how the mainstream news media are covering the election and whether or not they are being too deferential. Those concerns date back to the 2016 presidential election, when then candidate Donald Trump was given a disproportionate amount of airtime.
And so what we saw during the campaign in terms of this elevated level of interest continued on into his presidency and helped a lot of places that were otherwise actually in trouble post really remarkable audience numbers. MSNBC posted some of its best ratings of its existence. And this was at a time that when people's TV habits were actually changing. More people were cutting the cord, were getting rid of their cable subscriptions. And despite changing viewership habits, these news networks, these cable news networks were still posting these amazingly high ratings numbers in the 3-4 millions on certain nights.
Yeah, and just to add to those numbers, I mean, like the New York Times told Slate they closed out 2017 with 3.4 million subscribers, but they doubled that by the end of 2020 at the end of Trump's term, more than doubled that. Subscribers to the Washington Post tripled over the course of Trump's presidency. So like real impacts.
Yeah, it was a rising tide that did lift the boats of, in particular, the big news outlets that had a lot of credibility, that broke stories about Trump related to the Mueller investigation, around his ties to Russia, around some of his more controversial and inflammatory statements. And it was really quite remarkable the way in which it was able to really quite single-handedly boost audience numbers in a really, really tangible, measurable way.
What happened to all these gains after 2020 when Biden took office?
Well, part of Biden's pitch to America specifically was, if you elect me, essentially, it's a return to normalcy. You won't have to pay attention to the news, all the time. Not that everybody was, but a lot more people were paying attention than normal. And that was actually inherently part of his pitch to voters. And it worked. Pretty much as soon as he assumed office in 2021, we began to see a decline in those viewership numbers. We actually saw, quite remarkably, a reversal in subscription numbers, a real churn from the highs of 2020. The Washington Post, as you mentioned, had 3 million subscribers at the end of 2020. It's now down to 2.5 million. So, I mean, that's a pretty remarkable, huge drop-off, and actually contributes to some of the issues we're seeing in the news today. But I mean, essentially, it worked. Biden is not as interesting or compelling to news consumers writ large, and it's had an actual huge impact on audiences and therefore the businesses of these news organizations.
It's funny. I'm thinking of, those "Thanks, Joe Biden" stickers that were showing up on gas pumps for a while when the gas prices were going up. I'm like, who's going to slap one of those on a newspaper?
Yes, on Chartbeat, the thing that you use to monitor traffic.
Yeah. It's interesting. Baked into the whole Trump bump idea, and you can see it in that Les Moonves quote that you gave a little bit earlier, is the idea that the Trump bump isn't really a good thing entirely. Like, the quote from Moonves was something along the lines of, Trump is bad for democracy, but good for business. So it's like, I hear that, and I think news leaders knew this was a sugar high. They knew that journalism and maybe even democracy was getting diabetes from it, and yet they couldn't help themselves. Given all that, was there any wariness from news executives about embracing a Trump bump in 2024?
I think certainly there was more caution among, in particular, the television news networks and some places like the New York Times and the Washington Post.
But
I mean, it's difficult, right? Because news is such a low margin business. It's built on the back of advertising, and advertising has been cannibalized by Google and Facebook. Those Instagram ads that you're getting, those are the types of ads that used to basically power your local newspaper in some ways. And so it's this really difficult balance where the media, just like many consumers, is a bit tired of Trump's shtick. He's kind of no longer news in the sense that when he says something kind of crazy, if somebody has been saying something crazy for 7 years, is that still news?
We'll be right back. This episode is brought to you by SAP. First, the bad news. SAP Business AI will not help you generate cubist versions of your family's holiday photos, but it will help you understand which supplier is best to help you roll out your plant-based packaging in Southeast Asia, or identify the training your junior project manager needs to rise up the ranks, or automate repetitive tasks while you focus on big innovations. So you can be ready for the next opportunity. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI. This show is brought to you by Discover. In today's world, it can seem that the best treatment is reserved for only a few. Well, Discover wants to change that by making everyone feel special. That's why with your Discover card, you have access to 24/7 live customer service, as well as $0 fraud liability, which means you're never held responsible for unauthorized purchases. Finally, no matter who you are or where you are in life, you'll feel special with Discover. Learn more at discover.com/creditcard. Limitations apply. Going into the 2024 presidential election, there were always questions about how much the Trump bump would return and whether journalists should really rely on it. But Max Tani says whether news organizations wanted a bump or not, they seemed to revert to form. That meant the usual election year trappings, debates, town halls. And then they ran smack into a Trump slump. As Donald Trump's candidacy began to seem more and more inevitable, ratings went down. Pretty soon, ABC canceled a candidate debate they were planning, and then CNN did the same. Around this time, Max traveled to New Hampshire to see what all this looked like on the ground.
I wanted to go to New Hampshire in the week between the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary, which traditionally is ground zero for the U.S. national news media for a week. Everybody swoops in. Every major news organization dispatches too many people to go and cover it because this is typically where the national news narratives reset, right? If someone is surprisingly strong coming out of Iowa, it changes the dynamic of the race. If someone is surprisingly weak coming out of Iowa, it changes the dynamic of the race. These narratives that have been basically hypothetical or based on polling numbers are finally put to the test. And you get to see that essentially on the ground, in the week between these caucuses and the New Hampshire primaries. And that creates this mini economy for the city of Manchester, New Hampshire, really based around the Doubletree Hotel, which is, one of the biggest hotels in the city. It's where all the TV networks set up shop. This is a room at the Doubletree in Manchester, New Hampshire in a typical week in January or February is about $100, $110 a night. During this week, it can be close to $800, or more, or usually sells out. Yeah, $800 for a hotel in Manchester, New Hampshire in February.
Frigid Manchester, New Hampshire.
Yes. It's slightly higher than the kind of surrounding parts of the Northeast. But basically, this year, after Trump's overperformance in Iowa, that really didn't materialize on the ground in the same way that it did in 2016. The bar at the Doubletree typically stays open an extra 4 hours during that week because there are a bunch of political journalists and campaign officials who essentially have, are all paying for their stay on someone else's card. And so they'll go down and, and have drinks and catch up. And it's usually quite a lively atmosphere. And so when I rolled in 5 days before the primary and, went to go and, hopefully reunite with colleagues or friends, people I know from the political world, there's essentially nobody there. And that's because the news media has recognized what I think most Americans have recognized, which is that barring some sort of extreme event, it will almost certainly be a rematch between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And so if that's the case, why are we sending 50 people to New Hampshire to go and talk to voters and, stand out in the freezing colds?
But as you said, the whole machinery of journalism is set up for these 4-year cycles. So it's kind of like the news business is in this little hole of its own making.
That certainly is true. And I think in a traditionally, it hasn't really been a problem because politics tends to reset itself. The party that loses the presidential election oftentimes takes a look in the mirror and says, you know what, voters rejected that thing that we just put in front of them. Let's put something new in front of them.
But now we're stuck.
But now we are, for various reasons, we're stuck. And so that's something that I think a lot of people in the country obviously aren't happy about. And I think it's something that's detrimental to the news business, which relies on covering new candidates as these kind of new phenomenons. It relies on introducing people to things about candidates' lives and old things from their voting records that they didn't know about, or, these new figures doing things that we didn't we wouldn't have predicted about them. When you have two candidates who have both been in public life since their 20s, both of them, and who are both, one of them is in his 80s, one of them is nearly there. These aren't people who are changing or doing things that people haven't seen before. And I think that creates challenges for the news business, of which new is part of the word.
Okay, so you're painting a pretty bracing picture of a real cold stop for the Trump bump. But the thing is, by the time the Trump bump happened in the news industry, I can't help but think about how the industry had been in decline for a long time for a lot of reasons. Like advertising revenue was getting siphoned off by digital outlets. There was this over-reliance on platforms like Facebook to boost journalistic content. So to me, I look at the Trump bump and what happened there, and I see this rush of income that masked deeper problems in the news industry. It's almost like an emperor's new clothes moment now that it's gone.
I think that's correct. I think that what we're seeing now is, and what we've seen over the past several years, is very much something that there were some deeper problems that were essentially postponed by Trump. The pace of technological change has completely revolutionized the media business, and it's changed people's habits when it comes to news consumption. I think that it masked the Trump bump, and interest in Trump news masked a lot of declines that were or postponed a lot of declines that were inevitably going to happen as soon as people lost interest in him.
Is there some big swing out there that fixes this problem? I know that there are ideas out there. We've had billionaires come in and take over newspapers. And the idea was, okay, well, maybe the billionaires are going to do it, maybe nonprofit models. Some people have said, okay, places like Google and Meta should be paying news outlets for their content because essentially those companies are valuable because of the news content they help surface.
I personally don't think that there's going to be a silver bullet that fixes news. I in particular am slightly skeptical of the tech outlet. Big tech companies should just pay the bill because we've actually seen that what big tech companies will do in the places where they are required to pay news organizations, essentially, fees for service.
Yeah, Australia does this, right?
Australia and Canada both do this, and they basically say, cool, great, we're not posting this anymore. Facebook in Canada and in Australia, they just basically don't surface news content. So I don't think that that's a silver bullet. I think, look, the thing to me that gives me a little bit of hope in the way that I think that a lot of news organizations are moving towards, the ones that are smart, is rediscovering and figuring out how to cultivate strong bonds with the audiences that are particularly interested in those outlets. I think, we could take Slate as an example. Slate Plus, is a really great line of business for Slate because it is a place where people who love the content can pay essentially extra for it. And I think that, you can develop, those people who are Slate Plus subscribers can develop closer bonds with the journalists that are, or podcasters that are working at Slate. I don't know if it's like a perfect example, but a lot of news organizations and media companies are essentially, because they cannot reach the massive numbers that they need, the scale that they need to compete with some of the big tech platforms for advertising, what they can do is develop these closer bonds with the audiences who really, really care about and rely on their perspective and their news coverage. And so how I see it is news organizations are going to have to get smarter about managing their costs. They might not be as big as they used to, but as long as they continue to figure out ways to develop, close ties to their audience, to remain essential to the people who are willing to pay and engage with news, I think that there is still going to be hope for journalism and for media.
Max Tani, I'm super grateful for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Mary. It was fun.
I feel like I have to say I did not tell you to plug Slate Plus.
I will say I am full disclosure, I am a Slate Plus member.
Bless you, Max. Max Tani is a media reporter at Semafor. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osborne, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Madeline Ducharme, and Anna Phillips. We are led by Alicia Montgomery with a little boost from Susan Matthews. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you back here next time.
I'm Dahlia Lithwick, and I'm host of Amicus, Slate's podcast about the law and the U.S. Supreme Court. We are shifting into high gear, coming at you weekly with the context you need to understand the rapidly changing legal landscape. The many trials of Donald J. Trump, judicial ethics, arguments and opinions at SCOTUS. We are tackling the big legal news with clarity and insight every single week. New Amicus episodes every Saturday, wherever you listen.